Atheist, Q, and A.
Atheist Nation is a rare group to crop up on my Facebook feed. But in the aftermath of losing some very good video footage, I just happened to come across this one and decided to examine it in detail. The basic premise is a Christian asked, "What would you say to God on Judgment Day?" If you happen to be wrong, obviously. The person who probably runs this Facebook channel answered with a slew of questions that make any atheist proud, but any educator of Christian teachings sigh. Because no matter what atheists say, this person, at the very least, probably did not pay much attention in any lesson regarding theology. And so I'm deciding to sit back with a pipe and watch this video to see what responses I can give them. If you don't like them, that's your problem. As it is, let's see what she has to say.
Why did you stay hidden?
So you could find him in your own way. Just because you didn't find him doesn't mean he isn't there.
Why did you stay silent?
So you would stop relying on human constructed understanding of communication. When plenty of creatures communicate without spoken language. Dogs, for example, even small children, for heaven's sake, do not need to use coherent words in order to get their meaning across.
Why did you demand faith instead of providing evidence?
There's plenty of evidence. Faith is more about what is going to happen, what God is going to do, rather than what he has done. I'm going to do a long-form video entirely on that at some point, because that involves a lot of research, but I'm pretty sure that's where the evidence is pointing for that.
Why did you reveal yourself in a book full of historical inaccuracies and theological contradictions?
History isn't a solid piece of understanding. This is something that people constantly forget. It's a patchwork of loose information that is much harder to pin down. In a book written by humans, things are going to be seen from a personal perspective and not our objectiveness. Add that to the so-called contradictions, which aren't as many as you might think, and it's just understanding of the Bible, which isn't the only source of God's knowledge, certainly of godly knowledge, merely its spiritual home, the place where we should anchor all of our beliefs.
If you knew that the vast majority of humans you created would end up in hell, why did you create them?
If everything deserves life, then it deserves a chance to be good. Humans are not perfect. Nothing on Earth was. It was never designed to be. It was only good enough to work. And if it could work, it could improve. Hence why many people have the right to try. Just because everyone will not succeed, rather, not everyone will succeed, let me get that phrasing right, that's not God's fault. That's just life.
Why did you create hell?
I'm of the opinion God did not really create hell. Given the current climate crisis, hell isn't currently existing, but if we continue, it will, and probably sooner than we might wish.
How is infinite punishment justice for a finite crime?
Linking back to my last answer, try and burn down a forest and see how long it takes before you get tied to a burning tree.
What is the point of torturing someone in hell if they can never get out of it and never learn?
If by never get out of it, you mean you're chosen for hell, then that's railroading, which is a poor way to look at it, and simply removes all responsibility from you, which is never a good attitude to have whatsoever. If so, and you ignore God's laws because it doesn't matter, you've been warned and you face the consequences. If you mean never leaving hell, again, you've chosen to live apart from God, and He honours your choices. You don't want to spend eternity with God, that's perfectly fine. However, there isn't actually a safer option outside of God. So it's not so much God being favourite, it's you choosing the lesser of two evils in your mind. You learn that actions have consequences, and these consequences might last a long time.
Why would you purposely tempt Adam and Eve? Did you want them to fail?
God never tempted Adam and Eve. He gave them multiple choices to repent, which is always the irony of this argument. People making it do not take responsibility for their actions, and thus it causes more harm. I've done a whole video on this. The link will be in the description. You might find her handle rather ironic afterwards, by the way.
I mean, when I had children, I baby-proofed my house. I didn't light a fire in the middle of the living room and tell them not to get close to it.
Interesting, because my niece learned campfire safety perfectly at age 3. So, lighting a fire is a strange way of putting it. It's certainly not a good comparison, especially when children can learn to be safe.
Why didn't you condemn slavery?
People didn't listen to God to begin with, and so didn't respect their fellow man. His commandments to the Israelites made them understand the value of their fellow man, and made sure it was far more than any economic commodity, thus making man change the thing they themselves had started. It's a bit like pointing out how your actions in treating flies doesn't benefit the environment, but you do not stop them. You merely point out the consequences of that.
Why did you create rules explaining to humans how you wanted them to conduct their slave trade? Why?
Again, it would be so they could see the value of human life as people, not as trade goods. Clearly she hasn't read the rules properly. See a link in the description for my videos on the slave economy, and for that matter, the rules of slavery in general.
Why are there only 10 commandments?
There are many more, but the well-known 10 are far easier to memorise and hold as the base of human civilization and justice. If you add any more, they are far harder to keep track of. That's why most forget about the rest. And in fact, it's constantly riffed upon that not many Christians remember all the commandments. That just tells you that the bigger the number, the harder it is to remember.
Why did you think keeping the Sabbath day holy was more important to include than not graping people?
Exploitation of humans in any capacity is covered in the 10 Commandments. Number 7 is do not commit adultery, which is any sexual sin outside of the marriage bed, including rape. And do not covet is number 10, which can include do not be perverted or even think about raping. Exploiting people for work is the reason we have the Sabbath, and that's why we have days off. Hence why number 4 is keep the Sabbath holy.
Did you think it was more important to tell children they needed to respect and obey their parents instead of telling parents not to abuse their children?
The term respect in that particular commandment also means to ground or hold up. That does not mean elevate, but secure and ensure they are obeying the laws. This is a condition to obeying their parents, not to ignore their abuse, but to stop it, to make sure they're following God's laws.
Why did you make it possible for humans to physically hurt each other?
I just find it ironic for Americans to raise stuff like that. For them, I'll just simply say this. Is someone a responsible gun owner if they never had access to a gun? Is someone a good person if they never had the opportunity to be bad? Is someone a good husband if they never had the opportunity to commit adultery?
You didn't give us unlimited abilities. I can't just spread my wings and fly.
See? We've been able to carve out a place for ourselves in nearly every conceivable place on the planet, and many in near inconceivable locations. I mean, look at the people working in Antarctica. We were never meant to be in Antarctica, and yet there we are. Our abilities have surprisingly few limits.
You chose not to give us wings. Why choose to make it possible for priests to grape children?
A non sequitur, but it links back to a previous answer. If it's possible for someone to shoot up a school, why make guns available to buy and own? I think Americans in particular need to understand the irony of this position. Why blame people who have power when you have the power to do terrible things and yet complain about us having the same power?
How could you watch that happen in your churches, by your servants, and do nothing?
Like the person who has to watch abuse videos to find the evidence that will put the abuser in prison for the maximum amount of time possible. Not easily, but it would be far worse if you didn't watch. In fact, the simple fact that this is a topic of discussion is proof that someone dealt with it, that it was stopped, that the abuse was reported and the perpetrator was identified and caught. Things happen. We wouldn't be talking about it if we didn't know.
Why do you treat people like they're expendable background characters in other people's story? In trying to test Job, you allow his children to die, as though they're not people in and of themselves.
I would firstly ask what gives her that impression, since the Bible clearly states the opposite in the New Testament, that God loves all beings, right down to the hairs on their head. This is going to be ad hominem, but it sounds like she's projecting here. And if that's the way she looks at Job's children, that says a lot more about her and the devil than it does about God.
Why do you demand love?
Given the English term love is painfully limited compared to the Greek, Latin and Hebrew, love isn't as well understood. The simplest way of explaining it is thus: love isn't an emotion, but a promise. It is what we choose to do. I love my wife, but does that make a difference when it comes to raising my children? No. I choose to be with her full time. I think that's a different sort of love, don't you think? Not an emotion, but a commitment.
Why do you demand worship?
So the worship of God involves following his commandments, which basically are about being a decent human being. I get the feeling she doesn't quite understand that part.
Why can you not offer forgiveness freely? Why do you demand human sacrifice?
Combined due to the lack of understanding in both, Jesus is the only human sacrifice that's even worthy of the name. And it was literally God giving himself so we can freely receive forgiveness. If you understand that, then that's probably why you're not getting the whole idea.
Why do you demand perfection from humans that you acknowledge are incapable of achieving it?
God doesn't demand perfection, but he expects us to do better than we have done. And where we don't, that we learn.
Why would you punish people for not achieving something that they're not capable of achieving?
He doesn't. But you can learn. If you don't, then there are naturally going to be consequences.
When a school fails, we blame administrators. When a war fails, we blame generals. When a country fails, we blame its leaders. If this earthly system that you conceived of and ultimately created has failed so badly that you have no other option but to destroy it with fire, how is it our fault. Why do you blame your failed
Because we are bad at learning, and we refuse to acknowledge that the fault is ours, even though we are still holding the matches.
And if you really wanted me to believe that you exist, to trust that you are good, and to be inspired to follow you so that one day I can be the best, most loving version of myself, then why on earth would you send this follower of yours to my page to tell me that he is looking forward to the day I end up in hell? How on earth would that ever win me over?
God didn't. Someone who loves watching torture isn't godly. By this video, you've proven that his message has done its intended job, but not the one you're thinking. I can easily put the blame on the education system for the failing of these people, but often people just don't hold an interest in the topics until they no longer think it's necessary and let confirmation bias take over. So many things in this were ironic, including her saying that we have limited abilities to millions of people she will never see, from her living room most likely, on a device more commonplace than a cup of clean water in the hands of the needy. I think that is quite amazing. Speaking as much as you want about God being the big bad evil guy, but when you look at us and what we have achieved for those who live in the right place, compared to what we've done to those who don't live in the right places, you can see something alarming indeed. People complain about only the great Western nations that happen to be Christian being, having God's grace, but that's not always the case, and quite often it's more because it's the West that hasn't done anything about it. I'm not one to preach hell to people, but all I'll say is, if you don't listen to the things that will help, then you've only got yourself to blame, really. Multiply that by however many people, think the same, and you've got a whopping big problem that you've got to answer for when the day comes. If you don't think it will ever happen, I caution you to think wisely. One who wears a seatbelt and never gets in a crash is far safer than a person who never wears a seatbelt because he thinks he will never need it. Rules are there to follow, but more importantly to understand why they are there in the first place. The biblical laws are no different. By all means, question them. But just because you don't like the answers is no reason to ignore them entirely. So be willing to challenge things, but open to the response. Ultimately, we can only control what happens on Earth. If hell comes to Earth, we shouldn't really complain. Though I bet there are people that will, and refuse to take responsibility for it. So that makes me think she'll be amongst them. So stay humble, my friends. Stay safe, and God be with you.